The small town of Claremont, Florida was quiet, as it always was. A place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where nothing ever really seemed out of place, until the day it all shifted. No one had heard from Michael Shaver for 2 long years. His Facebook was still active, posting sporadic updates that somehow felt hollow. His wife, Lori, said he ran off with another woman. She even painted him as a man who had abandoned his family. But something felt off. It wasn't until an old friend of Michael's finally made the call to the authorities that the world of the Shaver family began to unravel. A simple wellness check, or so it seemed at first. But when officers stepped onto their property, they noticed something. Something that Lori hadn't prepared for. A new fire pit, too new, buried with freshly poured concrete. It was a detail too small for anyone else to see, but enough to make the officers hesitate. Lori, calm and collected, tried to play it off, offering coffee and warm words. But when they mentioned bringing in a cadaver dog, something in her shifted. Her reaction wasn't one of confusion. It wasn't the response of a woman who feared her husband might be dead. It was the reaction of someone who knew exactly what they would find. The officers didn't know it yet, but this visit would end in discovery. Lori didn't flinch. She had been hiding a secret for too long, and now it was on the verge of being exposed. The truth was buried beneath her feet. Literally. What happened to Michael Shaver? Where had he gone? And what lengths would Lori go to maintain the lie that had lasted for over 2 years? Michael Shaver and Lori Paddleford grew up in a small, tight-knit town in upstate New York, a town so small that everyone's lives felt intertwined. Their high school was little more than a few dozen students, but in that sea of familiar faces, Michael and Lori found each other. They were childhood sweethearts. Their bond formed early, almost as if it was destined. In 7th grade they began dating, and the rest seemed inevitable. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but it didn't need to be. They spent years together, growing up side by side in that tiny town, learning who they were and who they were to each other. It wasn't until high school graduation in 2001 that they made it official. Michael and Lori were married in 2005, settling into a life that looked like it was going to follow the script everyone expected. Build a family, a home, a future. After marriage, they moved to Florida, where Michael took a job as a commercial pilot. Florida, with its bustling tourism industry, was an opportunity, one that seemed promising for a man who loved flying. They built their lives in the Lake County area, a community shaped by Disney World's proximity. Michael, the enthusiastic pilot, spent his days flying over the sprawling theme park, while Lori focused on raising their children, a girl in 2008 and a boy in 2011. They spent weekends on family outings, and their lives seemed, well, normal. But no life is truly perfect. There were always hints that things weren't quite as they appeared. A small-town life in the shadow of Orlando meant that the Shavers' story was more complicated than it seemed at first. Their relationship, while once full of promise, wasn't without its struggles. They'd had their share of arguments, disagreements, and emotional distance. At one point, Michael and Lori even split up, but they reconciled quietly, without much fanfare or public attention. They kept their struggles private, tucked away behind the quiet smiles and carefully curated images of family life they presented to the world. For a while, that seemed to be enough. They made their peace, and life in Claremont moved on. But as much as they tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy, the cracks began to show. Life wasn't just happening to Michael and Lori, it was catching up with them. And no one would realize it until much later. The clock was ticking and the cracks were about to split wide open. It was in November of 2015, when Michael Shaver simply disappeared. There was no warning, no sign that anything was wrong. One moment he was just living his life, working as a commercial pilot, and spending time with his family. The next, he was gone. Vanished. without a trace. Laurie told everyone that Michael had run off. She claimed he'd left her and the kids to start a new life with another woman. It wasn't an outlandish story, at least on the surface. People believed it because it fit the narrative she was presenting. A man who had grown tired of his life and walked away without a second thought. After all, people had seen this happen before. But the longer the story went on, the more details didn't add up. Michael wasn't the type to just vanish, not without a word, not without any explanation. He was a man who had worked hard, who had family who cared for him, who had a reputation for being responsible. His boss, in particular, was stunned when Michael suddenly texted him in November 2015 to quit his job. Michael had been an exemplary employee, always on time, always reliable. A sudden resignation like this was completely out of character, leaving the people around him baffled. Everything was baffled, and yet Laurie's story was consistent. He had run off, started a new life somewhere else. The months passed, and as time went on, more odd things began to happen. Michael's Facebook account remained active, posting photos and updates that seemed to come from someone who was very much alive. But Michael hadn't been seen physically by anyone. His family, his friends, his co-workers, for over 2 years. And then there was the photo of him fishing, posted to his account in March 2017. A friend of his pointed out something unsettling. The photo was taken 2 years earlier, a detail that raised suspicion. Why would someone post a photo of Michael that had been taken years before, as though nothing had changed? Bittersweet salt. The inconsistencies didn't stop there. Laurie's behavior grew more erratic. She stuck to her story, saying Michael had run off. But the more she spoke, the more people began to doubt her version of events. She had never filed for divorce, nor did she file for child support or custody. If he really left them behind, wouldn't she have taken those steps to protect herself and the kids? But she didn't. Instead, she quietly started selling off Michael's belongings. His expensive tools, his guns, his personal effects, as though he'd never return. Laurie's story wasn't holding up, but no one knew where to turn. Until one day, Michael's old friend from New York couldn't take it anymore. This friend hadn't heard from Michael in so long that the silence had become unbearable. The unease had built up, and the suspicion had grown too large to ignore. So, in February 2018, he contacted the Lake County Sheriff's Office and asked for a wellness check on his old friend. This call set everything in motion. When the deputies arrived at the Shaver home, Laurie greeted them with her usual calm demeanor. She welcomed them inside, offering coffee, chatting about life, and presenting the picture of a woman who seemed nothing like someone with a deep, dark secret. But when the officers mentioned the possibility of bringing in a cadaver dog, something in Laurie changed. Her face went tight, her body stiffened. She was no longer the gracious host. "Has she done?" she interrupted. She was no longer the gracious host. The fire pit in the backyard, a recent addition, caught the attention of one of the deputies. It was too new, too clean, and something about it made the officer uneasy. A seemingly innocent backyard feature, yet it was the very thing that would soon lead them to the truth. Laurie tried to play it off, but her nerves were clear. As the deputies casually suggested they might bring in the dog to check, Laurie's tone shifted. She was no longer the picture of hospitality. Something about the suggestion made her uneasy. Too uneasy. Lorianne herself made no attempt to conceal her alarm, and his suspicions did not cease. Little did she know, this was the beginning of the end for her carefully constructed story. The search was just getting started, and soon, everything Laurie had tried to keep hidden would be uncovered. The deputies didn't waste any time. Their instincts told them something was off, even though Laurie continued to act as though nothing was wrong. She offered them coffee, smiled as though she were hosting a casual visit, and insisted everything was fine. But the moment they mentioned bringing in a cadaver dog, the air in the room shifted. Laurie's reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible, But it wasn't lost on the officers. It wasn't the kind of reaction you'd expect from a woman whose husband had supposedly left her 2 years ago. It wasn't the panic of someone who feared that something terrible might be uncovered. It was the fear of someone who knew exactly what they'd find. They continued their conversation, but the deputies couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. And when they stepped outside to the backyard, their suspicions only deepened. The fire pit was the kind of feature that might go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. But the officers noticed. It was too new, too pristine, with freshly poured concrete that didn't match the rest of the yard. They asked Laurie about it, but she responded with a nonchalant shrug. "Oh, we built it for the family," she explained, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. But the deputies weren't buying it. They exchanged looks, each one silently agreeing that they needed to look closer. It didn't take long for them to suggest bringing in a cadaver dog, something that might seem like a routine procedure in a case like this. But for Laurie, it was a moment of exposure. Her reaction was immediate, almost frantic. "You must be joking," she snapped. The tone of her voice was sharp, a stark contrast to the hospitable demeanor she'd shown moments before. In that instant, the mask slipped, revealing something far more unsettling. Laurie's body language shifted. She stepped back from the officers, her face pale. For the first time, she didn't want them to dig around. But by then it was too late to back out. The officers pushed forward, their suspicions now more certain than ever. They needed to investigate that fire pit. They had no choice but to dig, and as they began to remove the concrete slab, the weight of what they were about to uncover pressed down on the entire scene. Every shovel of dirt, every chip of concrete pulled away, felt like it brought them closer to the truth. And with each passing moment, the tension thickened. Laurie watched, but she didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in her backyard, and her silence was deafening. There was no more hospitality, no more friendly gestures. Just a woman standing by, helpless to stop what was coming next. The dog arrived shortly after, a trained cadaver dog that immediately zeroed in on the site. The dog's response was unmistakable. There was something buried there, something that didn't belong. The officers knew it, but they couldn't say anything just yet. They continued to dig, and then, as if by fate, they hit something solid. A small, crumpled object surfaced, a piece of clothing. The team continued digging, and what they unearthed next was something no one could have anticipated. Human remains. The remains were badly decomposed, but the officers didn't need confirmation to know whose body they had found. Michael Shaver, the man who had been missing for over 2 years, had been buried under his wife's backyard the entire time. Laurie's reaction was swift, but it wasn't the shock or grief of a woman who had just learned the horrifying truth about her husband's fate. It was the same defensive, guarded response she had shown earlier. But this time, there was no more hiding behind the polite gestures or rehearsed explanations. The truth was out. The lie had crumbled. The authorities didn't need to say it out loud, but the implications were clear. Laurie had known. She had known all along where Michael was, and now her carefully constructed story was falling apart. The question wasn't whether Michael had run away, it was how and why he had ended up buried in her own backyard. The truth was beginning to take shape, and with it, the fear that had been simmering under the surface for so long finally emerged. What had Laurie done? How far had she gone to cover up the truth? And what had driven her to bury her husband in the backyard like some kind of forgotten secret? The investigation was only just beginning, but already the answers seemed painfully clear. The moment the officers unearthed the remains, the air around them seemed to tighten. The discovery was not just an unspoken confirmation of what everyone feared. It was the unraveling of a story that had been carefully constructed, layer by layer, for over 2 years. The remains, still too decomposed to make an immediate identification, were slowly uncovered. Each piece that came to light sent a ripple through the small group of deputies. A patch of clothing, a bone, another small, unmistakable detail. A part of a human skull. And then, finally, the full weight of the evidence came crashing down. There, buried beneath the concrete in Laurie Shaver's backyard, were the remains of Michael Shaver. The man who, according to Laurie, had run off and abandoned his family, had actually been lying just a few feet from their home, his body left to rot in the dirt. The officers knew it without having to say a word. But the truth didn't need to be confirmed with a signature. It was written in the skeletal remains staring back at them. The discovery hit hard, not just for the deputies, but for everyone involved in the case. For the neighbors, for the community, and for the family who had been left to question what had really happened to Michael. How could Laurie, his wife, the mother of his children, have carried on for so long with such a twisted, audacious lie? As the deputies stood back and surveyed the scene, Laurie remained eerily calm. She didn't show the shock or disbelief that most would feel upon realizing their husband had been dead the entire time. No, instead, she stared at the excavation with a hollow expression, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. She didn't apologize. She didn't break down. She didn't even offer an explanation. But as the days unfolded, the truth began to slowly leak out. Michael had been shot in the back of the head, execution style, as if to ensure there would be no chance of survival. A single bullet wound from a .38 caliber gun. The same gun that investigators would later learn had been kept by Laurie herself. It wasn't just the manner of death that raised alarms. It was the sheer lack of care in how Laurie had handled everything since Michael disappeared. Her social media accounts had continued to show life updates as though nothing had changed. Laurie kept posting, updating Michael's friends and family with fabricated stories, pretending as though he were out living a new life somewhere far away. But the lies were catching up with her. Laurie's story was a tangled web of inconsistencies, each version more improbable than the last. She told some people that Michael had gone back to New York, others that he had run off to California. She even told a few people that he was stalking her. The different versions made it clear that Laurie wasn't just trying to cover up what happened. She was trying to control the narrative, to rewrite Michael's fate in a way that suited her. However, the evidence spoke for itself. Her claims about Michael abandoning her and starting a new life were shattered in an instant. The skeletal remains found beneath her backyard told a far darker story, one that Laurie could no longer hide. And yet, even as the truth loomed, Laurie continued to deny her involvement. She stuck to her story that Michael had just walked away from everything, leaving her behind, with no regard for the family he had once cherished. But as more pieces of the puzzle were put together, the truth began to feel inescapable. The discovery of Michael's body was just the beginning. What followed would expose Laurie's carefully crafted lie for what it was, a desperate attempt to hide a crime so heinous that even she couldn't keep it buried for long. As the police began to piece together the timeline of Michael's death, they found the chilling reality that Laurie had likely known exactly what had happened to him all along, and had lived with the secret for over 2 years. All while continuing to manipulate everyone around her. The truth had been buried beneath concrete, hidden in plain sight. And now, it was finally coming to light. As the truth about Michael's death began to unfold, Laurie's carefully constructed web of lies started to unravel, in ways that left everyone around her questioning how far she was willing to go to maintain her story. Even after the discovery of Michael's remains, Laurie's grip on her version of events didn't loosen. Instead, it seemed to grow more desperate, more erratic with each passing day. Laurie's refusal to accept the mounting evidence was nothing short of chilling. She continued to insist that Michael had simply left. He had run away to start a new life, and she was the victim of a man who had abandoned her. It was a convenient story, one that shielded her from any responsibility. But the more she clung to it, the more glaring the holes in her narrative became. Her story shifted from one version to the next. At first, it was that Michael had gone back to New York, reconnecting with old friends or family, she said. Then it was California. Sometimes, she claimed, he was still living in the area, just hiding from her, stalking her even. The details kept changing, almost as if Laurie was scrambling to keep ahead of the truth, tailoring her stories to fit whatever the situation demanded. But as her stories grew more inconsistent, the people around her began to notice the cracks. Neighbors, friends, and even family began to question why she hadn't filed for divorce or tried to secure custody of her children. If Michael really had abandoned her, why hadn't she taken the necessary steps to protect herself and her kids? Why had she never sought child support or even legal separation? The suspicions grew. And yet, Laurie stayed calm. Too calm. She was the picture of composure when questioned, never showing the grief or confusion that someone in her situation might feel. Instead, her demeanor was almost rehearsed, as if she had been preparing for this moment all along. She was a woman who had been caught in a lie but refused to admit it. Laurie's efforts to maintain the lie were relentless, but each time she added a new story, a new detail, she only made things worse. Her actions painted a picture of a woman who was determined to keep her secret hidden, no matter the cost. And the more she lied, the more obvious it became that her deception was the only thing she truly feared losing. But with every story she told, with every relationship she started, the walls began to close in. People started to talk. They shared the inconsistencies in Laurie's version of events, the odd behavior, and the way her story shifted depending on who she was speaking to. The whispers of doubt grew louder, and soon it became impossible to ignore. Laurie, the stakes were growing higher, and the pressure was mounting. The lies she had told to protect herself were starting to catch up with her. But instead of admitting to the truth, she dug in deeper. She had convinced herself that if she could just hold on a little longer, if she could just control the narrative a little more, the truth might never catch up with her. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the longer she kept up the act, the worse it would be when everything finally came crashing down. And it would. The day Laurie Shaver was arrested felt like the inevitable moment the entire community had been waiting for. Yet somehow, it still took everyone by surprise. By then, the story of Michael Shaver's disappearance had stretched over 2 years, a story that had been crafted from half-truths and contradictions. But as the police gathered the evidence, physical, digital, and circumstantial, their case against Laurie began to tighten around her like a noose. It was in September 2020 when the Lake County Sheriff's Office finally acted. After months of investigation, months of piecing together the fragmented details, they arrested Laurie on charges of second-degree murder, domestic violence, and being an accessory after the fact. But even then, Laurie refused to break. She continued to deny any involvement, her face a mask of disbelief, as if the truth wasn't already staring her down. Her arrest came after investigators uncovered more damning evidence, tying her to the crime in ways that were impossible to ignore. Her own cell phone data showed she hadn't communicated with Michael at all after November 2015. Yet she had kept up appearances, posting as him on his Facebook page, maintaining the illusion of a man still out there, living a life. The concrete fire pit, the remains in her backyard, those were just the physical manifestations of her lies. But it was her constant manipulation of those around her that proved to be just as critical. Laurie had even taken to social media, posting a video that turned the entire situation into a tragic plea for sympathy. In the video, she insisted that she had been framed, that the police had planted Michael's body in her backyard. She even suggested the possibility of a conspiracy against her, calling it political reasons for her being targeted. She asked for money to pay for her legal fees, directing people to her PayPal account, as though she were the victim in this whole ordeal. It was a performance, an act designed to pull at the heartstrings of anyone who would listen. But those who knew Laurie weren't buying it. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and no amount of pleading or manipulation could change that. The prosecution had the phone records, the photos, and most damning of all, Michael's body buried in her own backyard. But Laurie wasn't ready to concede. Her claim of innocence, though hollow, was all she had left. Her defense attorneys tried everything they could to salvage her case, but they were fighting an uphill battle. At one point, they even tried to turn the case in an unexpected direction, shifting the blame onto Laurie's young daughter, Isabel. The defense team suggested that it was Isabel who had killed Michael in self-defense. After witnessing an argument between her parents, they painted a picture of an abusive relationship, one in which Michael had been the aggressor. But the attempt to shift blame onto a 7-year-old was as flimsy as it was cruel. The defense didn't hold. The jury wasn't swayed by the idea of a young child committing murder in defense of her mother. Instead, they saw it for what it was, a desperate ploy to protect the woman who had orchestrated this entire tragedy. As the trial progressed, more and more details about Laurie's life came to light, further solidifying the case against her. It was clear that she had lived in denial for years, constructing a life where Michael was still out there, still somewhere, while she continued on with her own life, unhindered, unburdened by the weight of the man she had killed. She had even gone as far as holding a commitment ceremony with another man, Travis Filmer, in her own backyard, just feet away from where her husband's remains had been buried. This was the last any drama that Travis Filmer was going to see. Her actions spoke volumes. She wasn't just a grieving wife trying to make sense of a tragedy. She was a woman who had killed her husband and then carried on as if nothing had happened. The trial, which had seemed so distant and complicated just months before, now felt like the inevitable conclusion to a story that had been waiting to unfold. Her mother seemed like a liar. In November 2024, after nearly a decade since Michael's death, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as Laurie was led away in handcuffs, her face devoid of emotion, her lips pressed together tightly. She had fought every step of the way, even to the bitter end, but now there was no escape. The story that had captivated a community, a family, and an entire investigation was finally coming to a close. Laurie was sentenced, her fate sealed. The truth, long buried under layers of lies, had come out, and no amount of manipulation or denial could change it. The trial was over, but for the people who had been close to Michael, the damage had already been done. For them, there was no real closure. They had lost a man who had once been a part of their lives, only to have him replaced with a story so false and twisted that it took years to untangle. Laurie's arrest and trial may have brought the truth to light, but it was the years of pain and manipulation that left the deepest scars. The trial of Laurie Shaver had dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Almost a decade had passed since Michael's death, and yet here they were, finally at the moment of reckoning. The courtroom was tense, each day of the trial a new chapter in a story that had begun with a husband's disappearance and ended with his wife's calculated betrayal. The defense had tried to paint a picture of Michael as the aggressor, claiming that his abusive behavior had driven Laurie to act in self-defense. They brought up old records of domestic violence accusations, trying to establish a narrative of fear and danger. But even as they tried to shift the focus, it was clear that the weight of the evidence was against Laurie. The prosecution had laid out its case meticulously. The phone records, the photos, the gun, the concrete fire pit, and most importantly, the remains of Michael Shaver. His body buried beneath Laurie's backyard for years, while she continued to live her life as if nothing had happened. They presented their argument with precision, each piece of evidence adding to the mounting evidence of Laurie's guilt. There was no room for doubt. Laurie had lied for years, manipulating everyone around her, including her children, while keeping the secret of what she had done buried in her own home. The most damning testimony came from those who knew Laurie best. Her friends and family, who had once supported her claims, now testified to the inconsistencies in her story. They spoke of her strange behavior in the years after Michael's disappearance, the way she quickly moved on, sold his belongings, and continued to pretend that he was still out there somewhere. They spoke of the commitment ceremony she had held with another man in her backyard, just months after Michael had vanished. How could a woman, who had supposedly lost her husband so suddenly, carry on in such a callous way? As the trial wore on, Laurie's defense crumbled. They tried to introduce the idea that her daughter Isabel had been the one to shoot Michael in self-defense. But even the jury, who had been instructed to consider this possibility, couldn't accept it. Isabel, only 7 years old at the time, had no motive to kill her father. The jury saw through the defense's attempt to shift blame, and realized that Laurie had been the one who pulled the trigger. It was almost poetic in a way, the way Laurie had tried to manipulate every situation, every relationship, and every detail of the story. But in the end, it was her own lies that led to her downfall. Her inability to accept the truth, to face the consequences of her actions, had only served to dig a deeper hole for herself. And so, after a week of deliberations, the jury reached their verdict. Laurie Shaver was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict aloud. There was no outburst from Laurie, no dramatic gesture, just the cold reality settling in. She had been convicted of the crime she had spent so long trying to hide. In the days that followed, the community struggled to come to terms with what had happened. They had all believed Laurie's story for so long, had all been manipulated by her carefully crafted facade. But now, the truth was undeniable. Michael Shaver had been murdered by his wife, and everything they had once believed about the Shaver family was shattered. Laurie was sentenced to life in prison, the weight of her crime hanging over her like a shadow. There were no more chances to tell her version of events, no more opportunities to manipulate the truth. The trial had been her last attempt to control the narrative, but it had failed. For Michael's family and friends, the trial had brought some sense of closure, but it didn't erase the pain. They had lost a man they loved, and it had taken years for the truth to come to light. The knowledge that Michael's life had been taken by someone so close to him, someone who had sworn to love him forever, was almost too much to bear. As for Laurie, she would live out the rest of her days in prison, her lies finally exposed, her facade stripped away. But for everyone who had been affected by her actions, the damage was done. The story of Michael Shaver had been overshadowed by the woman who had killed him, and then spent years convincing the world that he had abandoned her. The trial was over, the truth had been uncovered, and yet, for those who had known Michael, the wound would never fully heal. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Laurie as she was led away in handcuffs, her future sealed by the weight of her actions. The trial had been long, drawn out, and filled with unexpected turns, but it was finally over. The truth had come to light, and the lies that Laurie had spent years weaving around her family, friends, and the world were no longer enough to shield her from the consequences. But for Michael's family, the closure was bittersweet. They had waited for years, hoping for answers, hoping that Michael's disappearance was something more mundane than murder. Instead, they learned that the person they trusted most had betrayed them in the worst way possible. Michael had been murdered by his own wife, the woman who had promised to love and protect him. And though the truth was now clear, it did little to ease the heartache of a family that would never see their loved one again. For those watching, the story of Michael Shaver is a harsh reminder of how easily lies can consume a life, how deeply betrayal can cut, and how the truth, no matter how buried it seems, will always find its way to the surface. As we close the chapter on this dark story, I want to thank you for staying with us through every twist and turn. Stories like this remind us that the truth can be stranger and darker than fiction. If you found yourself hooked on this case, or if you want to stay updated on more stories that explore the hidden truths behind real-life mysteries, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, and share it with others who might want to dive into more true crime tales. And remember, as always, stay curious, stay cautious, and never take what you hear at face value. The truth has a way of finding its way out, no matter how deeply it's buried.